clutch kit should come with a clutch alignment tool, and this one is a Sachs. It says Mazda 05 on it, which is kind of neat. You stick the clutch alignment tool straight into your pilot bearing. And that is called a pilot bearing because it's basically a pilot hole for your spindle to sit in. The end of the transmission side, the long spline basically that comes off of your transmission, exactly like this, will sit right in that hole when you align everything correctly. And that's why you need this tool. This side has a bushing on it, similar to shifter bushings or any other bushings. It's Teflon coated kind of bushing. Put this and your spline count should match up, and it matches up perfectly. That's great. Just a little bit of play, but it's just an alignment tool. It's marked, it says flywheel side only, so you're not going to screw this up. It's almost impossible to screw this part up, but leave it to me to do that. Alright, got your pilot bearing in there. Make sure that everything's lined up right. And this is your pressure plate. That's your pressure plate side. That's your clutch cover side. Sometimes it's called a pressure plate, sometimes it's called a clutch cover. It just depends. Because the pressure plate you can remove and replace just the pressure plate side. And generally you would only want to do that when you have it resurfaced. So you can just get the clutch cover if you want. So if you order a kit, obviously you will probably get the pressure plate and clutch cover together. And there are 3 fairly large dowel pins which align into the middle here, and you have to put this around your clutch alignment tool and then into the dowels. Got your clutch cover. Put that around and you line up your dowel pins. Like so. You can see how far off this is. After test fitting all of the bolts, and these are M8 1.0s, all the bolts seem to fit up fine. They thread in just fine. You can find these bolts, these clutch cover bolts, at any auto hardware store in the country pretty much. But the flywheel bolts, on the other hand, have to be specially ordered from Japan because they have some master craftsman who makes it out of a special rock or hardened steel, I don't know. But they come from Japan, and they're $8 a piece. And you have to buy them from Japan. These bolts, however, you can get at your local store. So I test fitted all the bolts, and this gap right there does in fact disappear when you tighten everything down. So that's good. But I don't know if it's supposed to be like that. So I'm still in touch with Rock Auto, because all of the tutorials and guides that I read online have not mentioned any kind of gap. Okay, now we're ready to install the clutch disc. You will need 1 bolt and 1 crush washer, and the bolt is an M8 1.0 1 inch. I will be using thread locker on these bolts. Simply because I don't really like the fitment of these bolts in here. These are automotive hardware bolts, but they still feel kind of loose when I thread them in. They're not super loose, but I think using thread locker will just help kind of tighten that up a little bit, shim it up a little bit from the inside. So that's what I'm doing. Bolts that I have 13mm hex heads. Your bolts might be different. They might require internal hex keys, as I've seen on some cars, or they might be a different size bolt altogether. In my case, I have 13mm because I went to the auto parts store and picked up these specific bolts. They work, and that's what I'm doing. So just tighten these down. I've already tightened them hand tight. So now after all of your pressure plate, aka clutch cover bolts are screwed in, then you should just be able to take this right out. And your friction disc, clutch disc, is inside. Because nothing is holding up your friction disc. It's not bolted to anything. It's only sandwiched or squished in there. So the only thing holding that in place are the pressure from those bolts holding it. And then when you get your input spline, your spline will go in there, and then your spline will actually hold up your clutch disc. That's how that works. Before we install the transmission, we are going to have a discussion about greases and lubricants. This is a high temp grease, just a generic grease that you can pick up from any auto parts store. The temperature range on this is 500, so this is a high temp grease. High temp. And this is engine assembly lube with molybdenum graphite. This one comes with your clutch kit. This is also molybdenum based. Doesn't say exactly what kind it is, it's just molybdenum based spline grease. And you know this one is molybdenum because the factory manual calls for moly grease on your spline, and it says spline lube goes on your spline. That requires molybdenum, so you know that's molybdenum. We're going to separate these two into low temp molybdenum and high temp grease. This is packing grease. These two have two completely different applications. This grease would be for something like this, your bearing. This is a ball bearing in there. I don't know if you can see the little balls in there. So we'll pack that with the high temp grease before we put on the new seals. Molybdenum is for high friction applications. So you have your throwout bearing, which rides on here, and it just goes up and down like this. That's basically the length of the travel for that. So you would use moly grease around here and on your spline, as well as on the pitchfork. This is where your contact point is, right below here. You can kind of see the rust spot where it's already started rusting through, so you can see the contact point, exactly where it's going to contact. Because I've had these two sitting up against each other for a couple days out in the weather, you need to coat the bottom because this little clip here rides around the back edge of this. So basically coat this whole surface with moly grease, and then coat this with moly grease, and coat your spline with moly grease. There's a little divot channel right here. I don't know if you can see that. It's a little channel right there. So what I'm doing is getting a finger full of grease and just packing that channel. And I'll turn that until you see the next clear spot come up, and just keep packing away. Alright, now after you're done packing your grease in there, then you want to clean up this lip, because that lip is where your seal is going to go. So let's get a whole bunch of paper towels and just keep cleaning until you have a clean seal. And because this thing's packed full of grease, it's going to go in there easy. There's another channel on the other side of this little edge, and that's where the axle seal will pop into place and stay put. Okay, now I have that seal all cleaned up and packed with grease. It only took me 3 paper towels to clean up that seal. So now we are going to install the axle seal. Now when you pack your grease in there, and then you turn the spindle, Try not to get grease on your spindle because that's where the moly goes, and you're not supposed to mix your greases. You can only have one or the other. I don't know why that is. I'm not a scientist, but you're only supposed to use one or the other. So try not to have grease intrusion either way between the two different types. After you get your grease packed in there and everything cleaned out, we're going to go ahead and kidding me? Oh, what? Oh, man, it's not one thing, it's another. That's alright, I can take those back, and in the meantime, I can install the transmission without those in. You can do that at a later step when it's already installed. It's not really a big deal. It's just another setback. So moving on, we're going to lube all of our parts up in here with moly grease. For that, I'm going to be using what's recommended for my clutch kit, which is this moly grease. You can use that if your kit doesn't come with moly grease, because my clutch kit is probably going to be under warranty, and you have to follow your clutch kit manufacturer's instructions, which probably also includes using their grease. Certainly don't give you a lot of this stuff. That's pretty thick stuff though. I'm just going to take my finger. I'm just going to go up and down the splines, around the spindle. It doesn't have to be a thick coating. It just has to be a real thin coating. You don't want to pack this stuff on there. But the rest of the grease that you have, that's where you want to go on your shift fork. Now the pivot point behind here, you want to put grease on, pack your high temp grease onto there. Probably goes without saying that you want to remove your shift fork before you do this and grease up your pivot point. Now when you install your throwout bearing, it does not matter which way you install it because these tabs are pointed in the same direction either way. So you can install this way or that way, it doesn't matter. Probably the easiest way to install it is to push out on your shift fork, make sure that's nice and level there, and then try and slide these ends on. Slide one on. Up. Okay, there we go. Alright, so back off your shift fork, install it sideways, and then push your shift fork down. Make sure it's on that pivot where it's supposed to be. Yeah, it's on that spring. That spring will hold it in place. Yeah, we're good. There you go. Oh, too far. Okay. Alright, I think we're good. Just remember that when you install your transmission, not to push your throwout bearing or your shift fork from the other side. Make sure that you don't accidentally hit it. This can just slide right off the shift fork while it's installed like this. Once it's installed in your transmission, you're going to have your clutch kit right here. So there's little chance of that happening, but just to be safe. I'm going to need at least 2 to 3 more inches of clearance in order to get the transmission and the jack to go under there. You don't have to jack the other side of the car up as high because it's not going to matter. You want it to be higher on this side. So it's actually a good thing that the other side is currently lower than this side. Alright, let's talk about jacks for a second here. This aluminum racing jack does not go high enough. You need something like a very large floor service jack. I don't know the exact height, but I just know that this one isn't enough. All you need to know is that the little racing jacks that you can get from basically any auto parts store, including Harbor Freight or Summit, are not going to be good enough. Like a 3-ton. I think that's a 3-ton jack, and this is a 1.5-ton jack. And the difference in height is, I don't know, that's probably only about 4 or 5 inches, but that's enough. So that jack's out, and this jack's in. Now that we have the jack underneath of there, I've lifted up the engine with this crane. I'm going to pull my jack out that was supporting that side of the engine, and then hopefully lift up the transmission and bolt it in. Right now the only thing that is supporting the engine is the one passenger side mount in this crane. But for all of you guys that you have to do this kind of thing by yourself, it's daunting. I wouldn't want to wish that on any guy. I mean, that is... And it's not a particularly big transmission, you know. It's just a tiny little thing compared to many other vehicles out there. Our transmission is fairly small. So we'll take out our clutch alignment tool. And I'm going to have to find a way to push back this harness and zip tie it up to keep it out of the way. Alright, I've zip tied the harness off here and here. Fold that out of the way. Hopefully that gives me enough room. Mazda did make it possible for this to be a one-man job by putting a dowel pin on the right side and the bolt on the left, meaning you can hang the right side on the dowel pin while you screw it in on the left. Easier said than done. Alright, here's what I figure. If you're going to do it as a one-man job, you're going to have to support the engine with jacks, which is pretty precarious if things start tilting and shifting. And then use your crane, obviously, to lift your jack. And you want to have it load balanced so that it lifts up straight. So you're probably going to need 4 chains coming off of it to grip it just right so that it raises in place. And there is plenty of room here to raise it in place. It's not really a problem. No matter how I raise it up on the jack, of course, it's teeter-tottering, and I have to keep one hand on the jack, or one hand on the transmission to level it as I pump up the jack, but even doing so, I don't have enough strength to keep it level. Transmission jack, if you got one, would be perfect for this. Unfortunately, for us DIYers, most of us don't have access to a transmission jack, and if you're going to do something like this, you absolutely need a hoist. You need a crane. There's no, you can borrow, beg, borrow, don't steal, but just beg or borrow for one. Well, I've gone ahead and taken the hood off because the crane has to rotate past where the hood latch is. So that's just 4 bolts, 2 on this side, 2 on that side. The entire hood comes right off, and you have to disconnect the windshield washer line. My attempts yesterday with my brother-in-law did not work. It was a failure, and it's only because of the way that we hook the chain up. This has to be leveled. It has to be load leveled so that it comes up straight and then goes on straight. And this is about as good as I can get it. However, I don't know if you can see that chain there. Not really. This chain is put onto the end of the hook, and you never ever want to do that, but this is the best thing that I could come up with. Now I'm just going to rotate it, try and slide it on there 1 millimeter at a time kind of thing, really slow. And make sure that spindle's on there. Feel that going on. Maybe I need to come up just a hair. What's going on there? Somewhat. Kick its ass, Devin. Do it, man. It's just I know we didn't have that spindle in there yesterday.
Is it going on there better now?
Yeah, it's a lot easier, but this is really worrying me. I want like a bolt to put through here, do something like that.
Find you a bolt and put on there.
That ain't working for me. Tool with it.
Look, is your jack underneath there?
No.
Put your jack in your transmission.
Boomer. You're so smart, never tell you that. As you can see, I have finally gotten the transmission, and it's just a combination of lifting up the jack, keeping it completely straight, flat, level, perfect alignment before you're going to put it in. And that means jacking up your jack on one side and lifting the crane, kind of doing a teeter-totter effect until you can get it in. That took me in total probably about 5 to 6 hours just to put the transmission and align it back on, simply because I just don't have the tools, you know, the load balancer and all that stuff. So that was a pain in the ass, but I got it done. Oh, and it's easier to do it without the mount. It is much easier to put the transmission in with this transmission mount off. Right now I have it supported by the jack and the passenger side mount, and that's good enough. Oh, and that jack underneath the oil pan with the block of wood. And that's good enough to keep it as is. As you can see, the gap, there is no gap anymore, so we're good there. All the dowel pins have lined up. Shift torque, check the operation of that. That looks pretty good. Everything's looking pretty good. So don't need the crane anymore, can take the crane back. Just put on that driver's side mount, mount it up with the jack, and should be good to go. Now I can start reassembling. Got it back in finally.